Hi, everyone. Today we're going to get into our third and final book of the semester, looking at the rich get richer and the poor get prison. But before we get there, just briefly recap of what we did for our last class presentation. We were looking at the subtopic of gender and how that ties into the institution of education. So specifically in the reading, we looked at how different dynamics that exist on the college campus increases the likelihood of sexual assaults occurring on college campuses. So we looked at cultural dynamics, how people define the college experience as a whole, as an experience that is about partying, having fun, socializing, and how that often involves the use of alcohol and drugs. And so when people are exposed to that culture and learn it, often that becomes part of one's social psychology. So the social psychological dynamics are people trying to achieve this college experience by going out, socializing, partying, and again, often using alcohol and drugs. So, on top of the social, psychological, and cultural dynamics, we talked about institutional dynamics, specifically how the admission practices on college campuses often brings together more or less people from similar backgrounds. And this similarity often breeds kind of a false sense of comfort around each other. You really don't know people what they're about, but you kind of relate to them because they're like you, and sometimes that creates kind of a false comfort zone. And that kind of false sense of comfort can lead to kind of potentially dangerous situations when you're kind of doing things, not really thinking about kind of what you're doing. So also we talked about kind of the pushing students out of certain spaces that are relatively safer spaces, such as your dorm rooms, your apartments, restaurants and bars, and then pushing people into spaces such as fraternities, such as house parties, that again, relatively speaking, are more unsafe places in terms of higher rates of sexual assaults. So again, kind of looking at a course framework with reference to the article, you can see how all three dynamics kind of come together to increase the likelihood of sexual assaults occurring on college campuses compared to occurring outside of colleges. Looking at our third book of the semester, we're going to be examining the criminal justice system as our institution and looking at the variable of social class being our class subtopic. So when looking at the rich get richer and the poor get prison, we're going to look at a thesis and also a subthesis. So there are two main arguments going on at once. The main argument throughout the book is, according to the authors, the criminal justice system's organization advantages the wealthy and works to disadvantage the non-wealthy. And so that's the main argument. You're going to see how social class as a variable within the criminal justice system operates to advantage the wealthy. And when you don't have the money, you're disadvantaged as a result. So you like to think that when people enter the criminal justice system, no matter kind of what stage you're at in the criminal justice system, people would experience it in the same way, no matter one's sex, no matter one's race, no matter one's class. But here the argument is your class does matter in terms of how you experience the criminal justice system, and those who have class, those who are wealthy, are advantaged, and those who are not wealthy are disadvantaged. And so the subthesis we can talk about is how the organization of the criminal justice system operates to reproduce crime rather than reducing it. So again, because say perhaps that we live in a capitalist system that does advantage people who have money and does disadvantage people who do not have money. So that's just the way things are. And if the criminal justice system worked in terms of reducing crime, perhaps we would be okay with the class dimension of it. But even on top of the class dimension, meaning that people who don't have wealth are disadvantaged and people who have wealth are. Even on top of that, the system itself does not operate to reduce crime, or rather it reproduces things. So the crime rates don't really change. And so it's ineffective in terms of it advantages people who have money and disadvantages people who don't. And it's ineffective in the sense that it doesn't actually reduce crime. The system as organized simply reproduces it. And so when looking at any institution, but specifically here, the criminal justice system, we always have to remind ourselves that the institution is always bigger than the people within the institution. In other words, the authors are not trying to critique the individuals in the criminal justice system, such as the police officers, the prison officials, lawyers, judges. It's not a critique of the people in the system, but how the system is organized. So keep that in mind, because we're not talking about changing people. If you want a more effective, more fair criminal justice system, we're talking about you have to change the organization of the system as a whole. So again, you're not changing people, you're changing the operation of the institution. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the institution and how it's currently arranged and organized, and how that works to advantage the wealthy and disadvantage the poor, and how it operates to reproduce crime rather than reducing it. So today is just a kind of brief introduction to the book. So in addition to looking at the thesis and subthesis, we can also get into what's really going on with respect to the crime not being actually reduced, but actually being reproduced. And so getting into now the subthesis, and we'll talk about kind of the main thesis more as we move forward throughout the book, but turning our attention to what you read today in reference to that subthesis, we can look at why the criminal justice system as organized reproduces crime rather than reducing it. And so what we can look at primarily are ineffective responses to crime. So we can look at these ineffective responses to crime with respect to what we know actually produces crime, what we know causes crime, versus how we respond to crime. So there's a mismatch here where we know certain things increase the likelihood of criminal activity, such as poor economies, whether it be an entire country's economy being dragged down, and when the economy turns down, crime goes up. Or it could be more regional, local-based economies. When those economies suffer, crime goes up in those areas. In addition to poor economies increasing the likelihood of crime, we can look at low job opportunities. So when there are not a lot of job opportunities out there, this again increases the likelihood of people committing criminal activities. Poor education often ties into the increased likelihood of crime as well. So kind of lower quality education doesn't advance you to college. And again, you see variables of, the more formal education you have, the less likely you're going to be committing crimes. And so poor education is another factor that can increase the likelihood of criminal activity. And also, again, kind of lower levels of formal education credentials. So like I just mentioned, those who are lacking high school degrees, college degrees are more likely to turn to crime compared to those who have the credentials. So another factor that correlates with crime is health problems. So specifically, we can look at addictions. So people who suffer from different types of drug addictions are more likely to commit crimes compared to those who don't have addictions, or those who are kind of cured of their addictions. So those are just a few things that we know correlates with crime. But in terms of how we respond to crime, we don't really focus on the problems, the poor economies, the low job opportunities, the poor education, and the health issues. Rather, how we respond to crime is we want to get tougher on it. So we want to give criminals longer sentences. We want to beef up policing, and we want to build more prisons to put the criminals in. So this getting tougher response to crime doesn't do anything to actually reduce crime rate. And so there's kind of that mismatch where if we address the issues that cause crime, then we could address, the problem of crime actually going down rather than staying the same. But rather than addressing the known causes, we have ineffective responses to crime. And those ineffective responses, getting tough on crime, it simply doesn't work when it comes to actually reducing crime rates. So there's that mismatch. We ignore the causes of crime and we ignore effective responses such as treating addictions, building stronger economies, providing people more job opportunities, and providing people quality education. Those things could actually address crime causes. Those things could actually reduce crime rates. But rather than focusing on the known causes, we focus on getting tough. And in doing so, the crime rates simply reproduce themselves rather than going down, rather than getting reduced.